I'm an ESOL teacher, and this is the title of my practitioner-led research. It followed on from part one, which was last year in the emCETT funding, looking especially at group conversations. You go into any ESOL classroom and you'll see students in groups having conversations. This is a sort of a method, a way of learning, that you learn a language by practicing it, and you learn a language by speaking to people. And we wanted to take a closer look at what went on in these conversations to sort of see any learning that was taking place. So we recorded and transcribed the conversations, put them into database, looked at them, used conversation analysis to look at the sort of interaction patterns between students, and the results came out in a booklet which is going to be on the website, I think. So, a sort of more traditional way of teaching English is to teach. You teach some grammar points, you teach vocabulary, and then you give students an opportunity to talk and practice these grammar points and practice this vocabulary. This is like proactive teaching. You go into the class with an idea of what you're going to teach, you teach it, and then the students have a go at trying to use this language. There's been a lot of criticism about this method of teaching, that, for example, this, what you teach the students find very difficult to actually use in a real-time conversation. Another way of teaching is talk and then teach. So the students are talking first, and then you're listening to what the students are saying, and then you teach based on what they're saying. So you hear what they're using, you hear the grammar they're using, and you work with this. So it's the other way around. This is like reactive teaching. So it's not necessarily going into the classroom with a grammar item or any sort of language item to teach. You're waiting for the students to speak. You're waiting for topics which are engaging to them and interesting for them to take root, and then you teach through this conversation. This is much harder than this, actually, and requires a lot more work. It involves really listening to the students and listening to what they're saying. And at the same time, it involves really knowing how language works in communication, not just as a sort of grammar syllabus, but really knowing the dynamics of how language works. This was why we thought that we could record the classes and we could make this part a little bit easier for teachers. Okay, so in the title it says working with emergent language. So what is emergent language? Working with language the students are already using. Not words and grammar we think they ought to be using. Looking at all the student conversations and looking at all the grammar items and grammar points that they're actually using is very different from the grammar that's on the schemes of work and on the syllabuses that we're teaching. So what we're teaching, they're not using. In conversations anyway. In written work, we see these grammar points coming through, but not in their speaking. That was one of the major findings from this report, that there's a big difference there. So again, it's this, students come into the classroom with language that they weren't taught, that they didn't learn in the classroom. And it's understanding, it's hearing this language and working with this language. Okay, so this is one of the research questions we have. How are small group conversations beneficial to language learning? Can I just add, I know Rachel and Kay, you're ESOL teachers. Are there any other ESOL teachers here in the room? Okay, 1, 2, okay. Any of you language learners, or have tried to learn a language as an adult? Yeah? Okay. So you can imagine that group conversations, speaking is a good way to learn the language. We wanted to find out what strategies do students employ to deal with the difficulties of speaking in a second language. So I was going to say that Rachel and Kate in their research about ESOL learner-led discussion in the ESOL classroom made the point that often our students are learning their third or their fourth language, and it's not actually their second language that they're learning. So this was something to bear in mind. What learning is taking place during small group conversations? So we can help students sort of leverage these conversations for their own language learning. What features could we see? Okay, so I'm going to show you a little transcript from one of the conversations. This little thing here means a pause. There's 4 students, 3 Bangladeshi and 1 Somali, all women, and they're speaking about the differences between communication now and 20 years ago. That's sort of the topic of their conversation. A is a student A and then student B, and so she says the communication is very good now, and student B says very good now. But that time, long time ago, if you wanted to communicate, to speak with a parent, you use a letter. And A responds, okay, write a letter, yeah, write the letter. And then student B says, yeah, 2-3 months they're waiting. So this is just a small little extract from the conversation. And we can see here the strategies that sort of students use to grab a turn. By a turn, I mean conversational turn. So student A says the communication is very good now, and student B immediately comes in and repeats, very good now. So just to give herself thinking time, just to grab the floor, because if she didn't do this, other students would come in and she'd lose her turn. So she was able to sort of muscle her way in using this sort of strategy. And a lot of students use this. They sort of repeat the last part of what their previous speaker said as a way into the conversation. And then she says, and then we have, like, she says, but that time, long time ago. But that time, a long time ago. These are just fillers. They're conversation, they're fluency builders. They're just, she's not really perhaps saying anything. She's just giving herself thinking time. The main message is at the end. If you wanted to communicate, speak with your parents, you use a letter. So she's got all these sort of fillers here, all this whole top line is just her grabbing the floor and getting the floor. And then the main message comes at the end. Use the letter. And then the other student comes in and says, okay, yeah, write a letter. So she's actually correcting student B very nicely within the conversational framework, very unobtrusively, from use a letter to write a letter. And we saw this a lot. Students are quite skillful at correcting each other like this, but not very explicitly correcting, just sort of implicitly, gently correcting each other. And then student B comes in with 2-3 months they're waiting. Now this is a wonderful piece of language here. What she's done, it's very emphatic. She's emphasizing that they had to wait 2 or 3 months. You would say this perhaps in written English less emphatically, they waited 2 or 3 months. Well, what she's done, she's put the amount at the beginning, she's fronted it and says 2 or 3 months they're waiting. For example, if you paid a lot of money for something, you'd say, £5 I paid for that. So you put the amount at the beginning. So she's really using this emphatic language, again, to muscle her way in and to grab the floor. The sad thing is, perhaps, that in a speaking exam, the examiner would mark this down. Because the verb is not in the past tense and they're talking about the past. And that's the prism, sort of the narrow prism with which sort of examining boards see English. And this is very much spoken English. And again, in Rachel and Kate's report, they said that we should be evaluating students on how they use spoken English, which is quite different from written English. But unfortunately, the criteria that examining boards use is very much based on written grammar, which is unfair, I think, on the students. Okay. Deborah Tannen was a big influence in this project. She's a conversation analyst, and she's written some interesting books, and it's a nice way into conversation. She looks at conversational cultures and the way men and women speak in conversation. Here's some of her books. And she talks about, she's a Jewish New Yorker, and she talks about a very high involvement conversational style, which is a lot of interrupting, a lot of overlapping, just as a way of showing solidarity. It's not meant to be rude. This interrupting and overlapping is a way of sort of agreeing with your conversational partners. And we found that our Bengali and Somali students have this very high involvement conversational style. A lot of overlapping, a lot of interrupting, and we were wondering how beneficial this conversational style, imported from their first language, is for learning another language. Because more hesitant speakers often don't get a chance, because they can't muscle their way into the conversation. Which is why sort of emphatic language like this and fillers like this are very useful items perhaps to teach learners. I'll skip that. Okay. We can see here, student B is saying, when I was young, I used to, the equal sign means an interruption. Student D comes in, and another thing is money transfer before they send it in the post. She's interrupted her and she's changed the topic, and she's used it with this little chunk of language here. Another thing is, very useful little phrase for students to learn as a way of interrupting. Why shouldn't we be teaching students how to interrupt? Why shouldn't we be teaching them ways into a conversation like this? Okay. Okay. So, this was just a really short little minute and a half extract, and at the end of the extract, student B comes in with a summary of what the conversation is about. This is what she said at the beginning of the conversation, and this is what she said at the end of the conversation. There's a minute between this, and there's lots of different terms, but we can see massive improvement just in this minute. The conversation has allowed her time to improve. So she says, for example, she says the communications, if you wanted to talk and contact your parents who are living in another country, you have to write a letter. And in the first one, at the beginning of the conversation, she says if you wanted to speak with parents, you use much more simple here, much more complex in this one, describing the parents living in another country. She uses a better verb here. In the first one, she says 2-3 months they waited. So we talked about this as very emphatic language and useful language. In this one, she says they didn't get for 2 months. So she says the same thing, but less emphatically. And here, she has better control of the verb as well. So it's one of the findings from our research, one of the main findings from our research. Why is talking in small groups important for language learning? And so just being in a conversation allows learners to activate language. It allows them to speak in more complex ways. And that was one of the benefits of speaking in small groups. Yeah, thanks. Any questions, if anyone has any? Yeah.
In the project, did you do any work with quieter learners on how to become more active in conversation?
Yes, we did. And one of the things was modelling some of this emphatic language that they could use. Another thing was pausing, and when they pause, quieter learners tended to pause at the end of a sentence boundary. So, for example, I like learning English because I can meet people. Whereas we were trying to get them to pause after the because. So I like learning English because, and then that signals to the other people in the group that she's got more to say. Quieter learners often paused at the end of a sentence, so it was like they had finished their turn. And they hadn't. And looking at the more dominant speakers, they often paused and emphasised conjunctions like but and because, just to signal to the rest of the group that they hadn't finished what they were going to say. And it was a technique that they had, yeah. So we're trying to model this technique for the quieter, more hesitant students.
Sorry. So did you use the transcripts at all for the learners? Did you show them the transcripts?
No. Yes, tidied up. We tidied up the transcripts and used some of them, yeah. But we played back to the learners a lot of their recordings, and we sort of looked at how they were speaking.
Sorry, yeah, I totally agree that that's a much better way to teach. But I think the problem is that a lot of teachers possibly don't buy into that, and a lot of learners possibly don't buy into that because they still want a bit of that frontal grammar-based.
Yeah.
Did you come up against any barriers
It's
on
still
that?
grammar-based, and you still look at the language that's on a grammar syllabus, but you're just sort of picking out the language they're using. And the two sit together. The two totally sit together.
Did the learners value that though? Because sometimes I think talking amongst themselves isn't really learning.
Yes, we're talking in small groups. Yeah, that's one of the things. So if we can teach when they're doing this and actually listen to the language they're using and work with it and improve it and expand it and model it for other students, we can show them that, look, you are learning here and we can teach you through this. Yeah. So the two sit side by side. The proactive teaching, definitely go in there with a plan, of course, but then the ability to react as well and respond to what the students are saying and teach through this. And there's a whole movement in language teaching called teaching through conversation, conversation-driven teaching, which is very much reactive, but it really involves really listening, which is one of the things that came up in the ESOL discussion in your project. But you really have to listen, and at the same time, you have to be listening as like a friend, but also listening as a language teacher and having this sort of representation of language in your head, and which is quite a tricky balance.
You have to have confidence in your own subject knowledge.
You have to have absolute confidence in your subject knowledge. Subject knowledge is key, and not just the subject knowledge of a traditional grammar syllabus, but subject knowledge of how languages are used in real time. Yeah. Okay, thanks.